Okay, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you've had a cup of coffee, tea, water, whatever, just freshened up because we have more programming coming your way throughout the day. So first up, we have a partner session from the Templeton Religion Trust. This is a sister organization to Templeton World Charity Foundation. They will host a discussion on religions as a source of individual, communal, and social flourishing. So to start us off on this segment, let's first turn our attention to this video on the science of spiritual exercises, after which Dr. Giovanna Jones, Program Officer with Templeton Religion Trust, will welcome our panelists.
Humans need to feel a part of something larger than themselves.
Something beyond immediate experience.
I think what religion has done can be wrapped up in three words: belonging, becoming, and beyond.
Over the last 20 years, we've seen a really drastic decline in the traditional indicators of religious belonging.
More and more people are less and less religious. There's decline both in membership and affiliation, and we're seeing the decline in the number of congregations, the decline in the number of religious vocations.
However, you still have incredibly high numbers of people saying, I still believe in God or a higher power. What's happening in this moment more and more is that people are unbundling particular practices out of the rest of the context of religion. So a really obvious example that we're all familiar with at this point is meditation, which gained a kind of secular language. Even if they could never tell you, what are the noble truths of Buddhism or what is the Eightfold Path. And you're seeing religion and spirituality travel into these secular places.
Fitness communities are a really interesting place to examine the dynamic. Because on the one hand, fitness communities are about optimization. They're about a person establishing goals that they go to that place to try to meet. And a lot of them are about changing the way they look and feel. In some respects, these fitness communities begin to resemble traditional religious communities in the devotion that they inspire and the fidelity that they have for certain leaders and certain elements of those practices.
Definitely one of the things that we see changing as people move their spiritual life towards one that is more a choose your own adventure.
There's some troubling diminishment from the experience that they might get in traditional religious communities.
Where are you finding community in that? Or are you just ending up in a pretty isolated experience because no one else has exactly the same mix as you do? We're seeing a whole new set of data emerge that point to the impact of these spiritual practices on our brains, on our health, as well as on the quality of our relationships with one another. There's a whole bunch of work looking at why rituals are effective at helping people feel a sense of control in their life or a sense of rhythm.
I think it does a great disservice to spiritual exercises to think of them just in terms of their functional value. Because most spiritual and religious exercises take place in a vast cosmology of ideas. This is one of the challenges in the science of spiritual flourishing, actually, is in how to study the mechanics of why certain spiritual exercises work without decontextualizing those practices so much that they become unrecognizable parts of that much larger thing. What will happen next? How will people continue to make meaning?
Religion is always mutating and growing and shrinking and finding new ways to live. And I have full trust that it will continue to do so.
I don't think that there's going to be any change to the fundamental human questions. Who am I? What do I do with suffering? How do I understand my place in the order of things? So in the midst of all that change, there is a kind of immutable human experience at the center that I think will not change and probably will never change.
Hello, I am so excited to be a part of this 2023 Global Flourishing Conference. As Reddy has already noted, I am Gia Jones, a program officer of Templeton Religion Trust, and I am happy to welcome you all to this session on religions as a source of individual, communal, and social flourishing. In this session, the panelists will explore how religious faith can positively affect outcomes that are indicative of flourishing at a communal and a social level. They will seek to answer this key question: what insights into the biggest questions about the human condition can religion offer? Our panelists for today, in no particular order, but I will start with Dr. Wendy Kaj, who is the Barbara Mandel Professor of Humanistic Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology at Brandeis University. She launched the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab in 2018 after founding and co-directing the Transforming Chaplaincy Project from 2015 to 2019. At Brandeis University, she serves as Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Brandon Vajanathan is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Sociology and Director of the Institutional Flourishing Lab at the Catholic University of America. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Notre Dame. His research examines the cultural dimensions of religious, commercial, and scientific institutions. Now to Dr. Matt Bloom, who is Emeritus Professor at the University of Notre Dame. For nearly 30 years, Dr. Bloom has led the Work Well Research Project. He and his team have studied the well-being of people who work in the helping and in the healing professions. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Ariel Levitas. She is the Executive Director of the Collaborative for Applied Studies in Jewish Education. Her research focuses on contemporary American Jewish education and Jewish life. She is currently Principal Investigator on a mixed method study funded by Templeton World Charity Foundation that investigates whether the practice of Shabbat dinner supports social connection and group flourishing. Thank you all to my panelists for your willingness to participate in this session. And for those of you who are listening in, who are tuning in, please just remember you can use the chat function to share any questions that you may have for us during the course of this discussion. So we're going to jump right into our discussion. We know that religious faith impacts the search for meaning and purpose at a personal level. At a communal level, religious participation offers connection to communities of faith that increases social capital and can serve the common good. The impact at this communal level is where we will focus our content, the content of our discussion on religion and human flourishing. However, before we get to the connection or the relationship between religion, spirituality, and human flourishing, let's ensure that we're all on the same page about these constructs. So we often speak generally about religion or faith, but clearly religion is not a single thing that is the same across religious traditions. Within and across traditions, there are differences in the content of people's beliefs, but also differences in the way which beliefs relate to action and the rituals that others practice. It's also differences in how the public and private aspects of faith hang together. I imagine human flourishing is another broad construct that could mean something different depending on who's talking about it. So as we jump in now and discuss the why and the how religion and spirituality is important for human flourishing, I want you to please be sure to give us some context on what flourishing means for your work. And Brandon, you can jump in and we can get started with you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, yeah. It's such a delight to be here and to share this panel with all of you all. So the work that I do looks at flourishing, which is broadly Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, or the sort of highest human good that is desirable for its own sake. I mean, I try to figure out how to measure that quantitatively. So what I rely on is something called the Harvard Flourishing Measure, and this is an index that identifies distinct domains of flourishing, notably overall happiness, life satisfaction, mental health, physical health, sense of purpose, good social relationships, virtuous behavior, and material stability. So all of those are measured quantitatively, and then we sort of try to aggregate them and see the relationship between various aspects of religious beliefs and practices with this sort of measure. And a lot of research, and this is the work that's done by this team at Harvard, but in my research, I've used this on various studies of the general population, religious publics, scientists, and other populations. And we find overall there is a positive relationship between religiosity, religious belief and practice, and this measure, and particularly in relation to, Gia, as you'd mentioned, meaning making, right? And that's one of the key drivers of well-being, but also the sense of community and social relationships, and how religious contexts provide models for and habits that are integral to a good life. So those are the ways in which I'm finding this relationship playing out.
Thank you. So, Matt, you've spent much of your career exploring the work environment, particularly for those who are in the helping professions. Would you share a bit about what you found as it relates to the relationship between religion and human flourishing, and really what brought you to this work?
Sure. Again, and thank you for everybody for letting me be a part of this. It's quite a conference. As Gia mentioned, we studied people who work in helping and healing professions. So these are clergy, international aid workers, domestic and global healthcare workers, social service workers. And one of the main reasons that I was interested in studying these professions is because we thought we'd find in the people who work there that they would have a sense of calling to their work, that this is deeply and profoundly meaningful work. And so we expected that work would have a tremendous impact on their well-being because their sense of identity, their sense of self, their sense of what their life is about is so deeply tied to their work. When I think about flourishing, we do have some specific measures, but when I think about flourishing in terms of our work, it's the extent to which people think and feel good about themselves and their life and their relationships, and the extent to which they feel like their life is contributing in some positive and meaningful way to the lives of others, to the world around them. So we do measure things like daily well-being or happiness, their ability to be resilient, their sense of self-integrity or self-worth, the social connectedness and meaning. And we found in general that, religiosity is either very, very strongly related to flourishing or very, very strongly related to ill-being or to languishing among the individuals in our population. For those who are flourishing, it's really a profound source of understanding their meaning and purpose in life. It's what grounds them in their work. It's what helps them understand why their work is important. In particular, it helps them be hopeful that even though they can't accomplish everything they wanted to, they can't end starvation, they can't end war, they can't heal everybody, there's a deep and profound sense of hope that they draw from their faith that their work is still going to bear fruit. It helps them make sense out of the presence of evil. These individuals come face to face, sometimes literally face to face with evil, with the people doing the worst kinds of things to other people. And so their faith gives them an ability to make sense out of how that can exist, and yet there can still be fundamental goodness to the world and to the work that they do. And it can give them a sense of a personal, how they as an individual are contributing to something big, something that has meaning beyond themselves. This is a core element of the sense of a calling, that I am a part of something meaningful beyond me. When it turns negative, it's when their faith is more legalistic and rule-oriented, and they think of their faith as giving them a lot of rules to follow, a lot of shoulds that profoundly inform them. And so it tends to either it could do several things. One of the things is it tends to make them rigid in how they understand what they're supposed to do in their work. And inevitably, life happens, the world changes, their work changes, and they find themselves fragile or brittle. They can't deal with the realities of their work very well because of this sense that their work should be one kind of thing. A quick example, a pastor who imagines his work as a particular kind of work, and yet real world ministry is complicated and different. He can't adjust to the realities of the real world because he has this rigid understanding of his calling. And a second way is when it causes them to invest way too much in their work. It causes them to burn out, maybe eventually collapse, because they don't see their religion as offering them any opportunity to think of themselves. Their religion continues to tell them that other lives matter more than their own. So those would be some of the ways it can contribute positively and negatively.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Wendy, your work is also with a group of helpers as it relates to chaplaincy. What have you learned about how chaplains support flourishing? And of course, please share with what flourishing means for your work as well.
Thanks, Gia, and hi, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be with you. So my work is mostly focused on chaplains, as Gia mentioned, who we think about as religious professionals that people meet outside of congregations, like in the military, healthcare organizations, higher ed, increasingly in community settings, ports, airports. You can actually find chaplains all over the place, sometimes called spiritual caregivers rather than chaplains, because the word chaplain has a particular history and understanding and meaning that isn't always accessible to all people. So we've been curious in our research and in our collaborations about what impact, if any, chaplains and spiritual caregivers have on people's spiritual wellness, which is really how I think about spiritual flourishing at the individual level. And we've been interested in this both from how chaplains experience it, but perhaps more importantly, from the experiences of those they're serving. And so our most recent kind of project has been in partnership with Gallup. We did a national survey in the United States looking at what fraction of people have had contact with a chaplain. The answer is about 18% based on the definition that I gave. More than 2/3 of those individuals meet chaplains in healthcare organizations, including hospice and palliative care. And then we interviewed about 50 of the people who'd had contact with chaplains to hear about their experiences. And what we hear is really interesting. You know, chaplains represent all faith backgrounds and traditions, including none. There are growing numbers of humanist and atheist chaplains, which makes no sense to some people, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. Chaplains actually serve all. So when Amy Lawton, my colleague here at Brandeis, who runs our research unit, was looking at the quantitative analysis about what predicts contact with a chaplain, we actually see that people from all backgrounds, religious and not, a range of races and ethnicities, genders, et cetera, have contact with chaplains, which is markedly different from the kinds of patterns we see when we look at other aspects of behaviors around religion and public life. And then when you talk with people about what they kind of appreciated or recognized or what the contact with the chaplain included, they talk a lot about appreciating chaplains' ways of coming alongside, of not judging. That came up over and over again, and of kind of being with them in the midst of some of life's difficulties. We also learned, quite to the contrary of how chaplains think about it, that most people, when they think and talk about chaplains, still think about religion with a capital R, a religious tradition. So while chaplains and spiritual care providers will tell you that they serve everyone, you know, they're not dogmatic, they're not coming from a particular religious tradition, which is all true, they are seen by the public as being much more narrow in what they can provide than what they experience themselves providing. So there are a lot of puzzles there that we can work through if helpful here. But that is how we have approached these kinds of questions.
Thank you. So we've got this highest human good, happiness, feeling good, sense of self, spiritual wellness. Ariel, you work with the Jewish communities and you explore flourishing as a group outcome. Would you share a little bit with us about the religious conceptualizations of flourishing within the context of the work that you do?
Sure, certainly. And thanks so much for inviting me to speak about this really meaty topic. So I think I do want to say one thing. I think it's important to remember in the context of our discussion that religion is more capacious, I think, also than our metrics for flourishing, and that religion can point to ultimate ends sometimes that go beyond immediate personal markers for well-being that we often associate with flourishing. So I just want to remember that. That being said, I am very committed to the study of religion and in particular social connectedness. I'll say that one thing I've gained through my own study of contemporary American religion, and again with a focus particularly on American Jews and American spirituality, is that we cannot flourish alone. And I've really come to appreciate and understand flourishing as a group project. So certainly there are concepts of joy and happiness in abundance in classical Jewish texts, but personal happiness has actually rarely been the aim of a well-lived Jewish life. Jewish life historically has foregrounded or required the need for shared infrastructure to fulfill religious obligations, and also foregrounded obligations to other people, right? And so this is laid out in a vast corpus of Jewish law and custom that governs family relationships and property rights and how we need to care for the vulnerable. And so this more collectivist lens on religious expression insists that you have to have a strong social connection, and insists that we need to think about and acknowledge our interdependence if we're going to fulfill what our religious purpose is. And American spiritual culture can be quite different in its emphasis, can be very deeply tied to self-help movements and focused on the individual body and the self as an arena for activity. So all of these kinds of inputs have made me think, I like to say, I think about flourishing like milk. And what I mean is I can go to a very lovely, very fancy market in my neighborhood and buy organic milk for my children. But the impact of a gallon of milk, or many gallons of milk on their health and well-being is probably pretty negligible, right? It matters more, can they play safely outside? Is there wildfire smoke in the air? Safe schools? And so sure, you can purchase small quantities of Flourishing, like in organic milk, but Flourishing really isn't like a single serve, individually purchased thing. It has to be shared. Everybody has to get some, and you have to pursue it with others. And that really shapes how I want to study religion and flourishing. So certainly, like, the academic study of religion has often emphasized more private and personal experience. But I'm interested in like a different unit of analysis, right? What flourishing looks like in the context of partnerships, small groups, and communities. And I think that there are opportunities and methods that we can avail ourselves of to investigate how religion can contribute to collective ideas about flourishing in our studies. So just as one example, the project that I'm doing right now that's funded by Templeton World Charity Foundation, an element of our study is actually designed around a cluster randomized trial. So we're trying to study small groups to observe how various structures of gathering can support not just the individuals in those groups, but also the shared flourishing that the group experiences together.
It's really interesting. Thank you all so much. I want us to, we've already begun to do it a little bit, but I want us to delve a little deeper to really unpack how this, the religious practice, and to your point, Ariel, we know that there are so many dimensions of it, and some of them not necessarily only individual, but the act of being together, but the religious practice impacts flourishing. So generally, it is not uncommon for conversations to, when you hear about religion, people to polarize them. It's good versus bad. However, we know that it's never quite that simple. And the work that each of you do helps to add some more nuance to our understanding of that relationship. Matt, I know you've already spoken a little bit about the kind of positive and negative as it relates to how religion impacts flourishing. Is there anyone else who, from the work that they have done, can speak to what insights you have learned about that relationship, whether it is positive or negative, when we consider religious faith and practice, and then wellness, whether it is at the kind of more individual within a context, or as area where a unit of measure is the group as a whole?
Say a couple of things. I mean, we've some of the research I've done in congregations, so looking at flourishing of people who are religious, we find some important differences between people in terms of their images of God, right? So you can talk about religious belief, but what is the thing that you believe about God? And we find peculiar things like, does say reading scripture help alleviate stress? Well, it depends on what kind of worldview you have. So if you're somebody who believes that the world is fundamentally evil, then reading scripture more frequently actually makes you more stressed out compared to somebody who believes the world is fundamentally good, in which case it actually does help with stress buffering, right? So that's one kind of thing where we see, there are contingencies depending on beliefs. And then at the practice level, we also find some positive and negative relationships. And there's this concept of social support. So we say, okay, faith communities support each other and accompany each other and so on. And it is true that it is one of the strongest positive impacts on well-being of religion is that it provides people companionship. But we find a couple of things that that complicate that, and one of them is that it really depends on what kind. So for instance, if you're talking about illness, right? If somebody breaks their leg and there's a fracture or can't go to work, you find a community rallying around them. If they're diagnosed with, say, bipolar disorder, there's no casseroles coming to your door. So there's stigma in faith communities around mental health, in particular in the United States. So that's one kind of difference. And another one is that even among people who are very frequent attenders and who participate in church and faith communities very often, we find that they by and large don't share their personal lives and problems with each other. So there's some variation across faith communities here. We find in our research that Catholic and Jewish frequent attenders, those who are really involved in their communities, almost never share their personal problems with each other. So these are people who are volunteering in their community and so on, compared to African American Protestants who share problems at a very high level. And that sharing life with each other is very strongly associated with our flourishing measure, right? So the more frequently you share your problems with people in your community, the better your mental health, the better your well-being. So trying to understand what it is about the dynamics of particular communities that cause these differences, I think, is really important. We see that kind of variation.
So it sounds like your work confirms Ariel's comment that we cannot flourish alone.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyone else wanted to add a little bit on just kind of what you have found, any insights that you've learned as you have explored the relationship between religious faith and practice and wellness?
I might just second some of what Brandon has said, which is that it depends who the people are and what they understand spirituality or religion to mean. And that I'm personally pretty skeptical of any groups or people who want to make broad, sweeping generalizations about, religion always impacting flourishing, because we can think of many examples in contemporary life where religion is harmful to particular groups. We may not want to dwell on them, but I think it's really important as social scientists that we think about this question in a way that sees the positive benefits and the negative benefits to particular people in particular situations, and keeps that in mind as we are thinking about how to even ask and investigate the question.
Yeah, excellent. So definitely moving our conversations away from the kind of polarized general kinds of conversations and speaking about the person under which conditions, at what point in time, with whom, just really adding those levels to our conversations. So as we consider religious practice in the 21st century, and just even Wendy, as you just mentioned, as scholars of religion, what are some common misconceptions of faith or other aspects of religion that you have found might hinder people from appreciating what they can offer to our understanding of the pursuit of human flourishing?
I might just
go ahead, Matt. Yeah.
Just to start, I find this phrase that's used a lot, spiritual but not religious, to be really off-putting, because it assumes that a particular understanding of religion is the only one that matters. Generally speaking, I'm a part of an organized institutional religious organization. There's a number of people that we have worked with in our research that they aren't members of an organized religion, but they are very religious in that they have a clear set of beliefs or values that guide their life. They're deeply integrated into the way they think about themselves and the world and their daily life. And so I think sometimes, as Wendy so importantly mentioned, there's these false binaries. I think another false binary is that I'm either religious or I'm not, meaning that I'm a part of an organized religion, and if I'm not that, then I can't be religious. I think that's a problem. The other thing is that, and I don't have a lot of data on this, but we have some, to think about people who really who say they are not spiritual or religious at all. And that's a group that I'd like to learn more about, but what we know is troubling. My sense is that you can maintain for a while a life that isn't grounded deeply in some sort of set of beliefs and values that, or maybe beliefs and values that you came up with on your own. But what seems to happen is at some point in time, these individuals start to think, well, gosh, if I'm the one that decides what's good and bad, and I know myself to be a pretty flawed person, maybe there isn't something really true about life. Maybe there isn't some core set of values. In other words, being a part, as Ariel so importantly mentioned, the social aspects of what flourishing are so important, but even being a part of a community that shares your values seems to be fundamentally important to being religious or spiritual. I need to be with other people that affirm my values, that help me understand them more deeply and help me live them out. So I think this group that I'm going to call not spiritual, not religious, perhaps loners, I'm concerned that over time they'll end up languishing a lot more because they need that sense of grounding in values, beliefs that that requires a community.
Can I jump in on that?
Of course.
I mean, so part of what I think is happening in contemporary American religious life is that there are these broad institutional changes taking place. Many, many congregations are closing. Some people call that secularization. Some people see that as part of the transition that's always been a part of American religious life. There are lots of innovators doing lots of things that are spiritually and existentially informed, but they often don't have names or labels that say religion or spirituality. And so one of the most common misconceptions that I would raise is that if we only think about religion as happening in the places and the spaces that are labeled as such, we're actually missing right now in contemporary life where all the action is. And I mean, I think about this in terms of, you know, we used to always, not always, depending on our age, but go to Blockbuster to rent movies. And now we still watch movies, but we stream them on Netflix. The congregation has been the traditional delivery mechanism, like Blockbuster initially, of content, spiritual and religious content in the United States. But what is today's Netflix equivalent? And we're starting a project where we're actually mapping the closings and the innovation, because I think we have to step back really broadly so we can see what is happening. And I just want to encourage us as we think about this, to see with broad eyes and to not require the things we're looking at to take a form that we've always been used to or be labeled in a particular way. And there are lots of examples that we could look to. And I think we as scholars actually don't yet have a good way of thinking about this because we all almost always see things through the lenses we're used to. And we've got to kind of use our peripheral vision to understand what's happening right now.
Thank you, Wendy. Before I move on, does anyone else want to comment?
Sure. I mean, I think in the American Jewish context, where we certainly have a rise of religious nuns as well, and also I would say probably a higher percentage of atheists than in the sort of broader American population. I think what's actually interesting is that you still see so much participation in Jewish life, even with these kinds of orientations to religion itself. So like 95% of American Jews who say they have no religion do Jewish things. The majority of them own in their house a Jewish ritual object. So it is pretty messy, I think. And certainly we do see declines in congregational membership. And we can talk about that as a retreat from institutional religion or capital R religion. But I actually agree that that's probably not quite right, because also concurrently, at least in American Jewish life, there is, if we want to use the term flourishing, just a huge flourishing of these arenas of alternative kinds of institutions that are places to gather as Jews with religion, sometimes centered or decentered, but that are places to bring people together. So it could be recentering the home as infrastructure. We also see alternative places for gathering, like at arts institutions, museums and galleries and art studios. Gardens and farms are good examples of that. So there are these places for participating in community, sometimes with a religious lens or outlook, but that look different from congregations. And I think there are consequences to this. Like, it's not all perfect, but I think it's important that we're sort of noticing and curious about that.
So I'm just going to jump on and ask you, Ariel, because now that you're bringing it up, how do you suggest we might support these new communities of practice that are in formation?
Well, I mean, I think that sort of my own stance to this is that we ought to be curious about how people tell us they want to flourish. Certainly, I think, at least in the academic study of religion, our ideas about what good religion looks like and how religion ought to be good for you are shaped by particular biases about what good is. So one is we need to ask people how they want to flourish. That doesn't mean that we are, dissipating all our critical faculties for analysis. But if we're not taking that into account, I think it will be very hard to understand what's happening. So certainly when I see, changes in the kinds of institutions that are appealing, part of that is exciting and interesting. It makes me ask questions too. What does it mean that these new institutions are rarely, for example, intergenerational? And what might that mean for flourishing? What does it mean that these new institutions are rarely sort of cradle to grave in terms of the way they think about building caring and community across a lifespan, and what are implications for flourishing in ways that are meaningful to those constituencies? So my job isn't necessarily to say this is good for the Jews or bad for the Jews, or good for America or bad for America, but to think about what does this mean for certain groups of people in certain contexts. And a lot of these questions, I think, are good researchable questions that we can all learn from.
Thank you. So we have a question from the audience that I think ties into this religious practice in the 21st century. And Wendy, it's specific for you. Can you discuss more about the innovations and spiritual practice project that you are working on?
Sure. Yeah, we're just getting started in partnership with CLAW and funded by the Luce Foundation and a set of other partners, trying to map what spiritual innovation looks like. I know Brandon has thought a lot about this, and he and I are starting to be in conversation about this as well. So I want to hear from him. And what we're trying to understand are what are group efforts that have some legs, meaning they've been around for a year, have a certain budget or something like that, that people are beginning as motivated by spiritual, broadly construed concerns aimed at having some social impact. And Ariel has mentioned many such efforts. Farms are some. I mean, there's a lot of creative kinds of organizing happening. And there are a lot of networks through the Fetzer Institute and a number of other places that are supporting these sorts of networks of, we might call them spiritual entrepreneurs. But the networks we don't think are so connected to each other yet. And we just don't know how to map them or look at them. So in January or February, we're going to launch this effort. We haven't started yet. If people are interested in this or they're involved in such a group and they want to email me, that would be great, because we've been trying to crowdsource where to even begin. And we're going to try to do a kind of map with a short survey and then do a bunch of interviews to see what's happening, because we don't know. We can all point to examples and we could pull out 3 or 4 groups or organizations, but how it looks nationally is what we're beginning to try to understand. And again, many of the ones that Ariel mentioned are on the list. I don't know, Brandon, can I ask you how you think about these questions of innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the very early stages of a project that Templeton Religion Trust is actually funding, which is trying to actually map out what innovation even means and how do religious traditions and communities and scholars understand innovation, right? I mean, that's a concept that has a pretty fuzzy definition, and it's a term that has been changing in its value over the centuries. 200 years ago, if you called something innovative a couple hundred years ago, it would have been a pejorative. Like, this is something newfangled. It's a fad. It's something that's not serious. Versus today, it's now a judgment of worth. Like, everything has to be innovative, right? You can't get a PhD degree if it's not an innovative contribution. Your dissertation has to be. I mean, so how has this changed over time? But yeah, so I'm trying to bring scholars together to understand what they're seeing and what kinds of innovations they're finding in their work. And I think there's a lot of areas for clearing out misconceptions too. I mean, I think the concept of innovation could be fruitful in terms of thinking about how to change public perceptions of religion, because religion is I mean, part of the interest in this project is that when you think of religion, you don't think of innovation. You think of it as an obstacle to innovation or something anti-innovative, right? So that is one of the misconceptions, I think, of religion, is we don't expect it to change in any way. And also the misconception of religion being about rule following, right? Some bearded guy in the sky is telling you what to do, and that's kind of a public image that religion has. Or or religion being primarily now about identity maintenance, which I don't know if it's a misconception of religion as much as that's what it is becoming around the world, in the United States and in India and a lot of other places. The polarization is being fueled by religious groups in many ways, and is shaping the way in which we approach each other as us versus them, and even in religious communities, right? So thinking about what kinds of innovation might be needed there for the flourishing of people in these communities, I think is really crucial. And I would point to two things I think that have come up sort of in our conversation so far. I mean, one has to do with experience. So are faith communities still a hub of religious experience, or do those experiences now happen largely elsewhere, say in nature, experiences of awe and wonder and transcendence? Where do they happen? Where does one encounter beauty? Right. So I would take Ariel's question, and I would ask people. I have a project on beauty at work, and I ask people, where do you find beauty in your work? What does beautiful work look like to you? Right. And that's a way of getting at flourishing. It's a lens through which one can think about what a flourishing life looks like. And often in faith communities, beauty is people feel that's been stripped away in some way. And the other one is connection, which we've been talking about as well, like deep human connection. We yearn to know each other and to be deeply known by another. And in a lot of faith communities, that's not happening. So those two, I think, would be important ways forward in terms of kinds of innovations that might be needed in faith communities.
This is great. So if I'm going to, three words pop to mind as all of you were speaking: openness, curiosity, humility, which for all of you being Templeton grantees know that these are values that are incredibly important to even just Sir John Templeton and why we exist. And it sounds like the more open, more curious, and the more humble we are, we're going to be able to better not only just understand, but grow with the way that religion and flourishing is moving as we are in the 21st century. So we've got less than 10 minutes left. Can you believe it? And I want to close out as we think about how we translate and matriculate the findings of your research outside of the academy. So like the question before you would be, how can you as social scientists who study religion contribute not just to research, but the actual practice of flourishing? And I'm gonna let any of you, I want all of you to answer. So we've got 8 minutes. So all of you can respond with, even if it's just one thing. What is important to you for translating and moving from just the research to the actual practice of flourishing?
I don't mind going first because I think about this all the time. And in fact, we were talking about this yesterday in my undergrad research methods classes. First, I think we need to partner and collaborate with practitioners, because scholars certainly don't have all the answers. We're one piece of a conversation, and I think we need and do better work when we're in that conversation. Second is we need to take calls from reporters, preferably all calls from reporters. Third, we need to teach and engage our students in thinking about these questions. It's not that I can teach any student to flourish, but I can raise the questions in a classroom and bring, approaches that have been tried throughout the ages to sort of help them think about and have frameworks for their ideas. And fourth, and we're talking about doing work about chaplains and starting from demand, I think we just have to be really aware of who we're trying to reach and how to reach them. So do we need video approaches? Do we need social media? Are we really trying to talk just to the, New York Times readers public? Or are we trying to get the people who, stand in the magazine aisle at the grocery store and look at the National Enquirer? And we need different strategies and approaches to get to those different people. Again, not with the answers, but with the questions and with ways of thinking about where they start. And what, if anything, in our research can, kind of be that little nibble, that little piece that will kind of get them thinking or engaging in a different way. So lots of ideas there. We think about and try them all the time and try to model them through the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab as best we can.
I thought that was great. I love that. I'll just say that my Templeton project and the work that I do is always grounded in the principles of what are called research practice partnerships, which is a mode of research in education research. And it means that the work is always grounded in long-term, ongoing, mutually beneficial relationships between researchers and practitioners. And research practice partnerships take as the starting point the questions and concerns of practitioners. So my project has an amazing practice partner, One Table. It's a nonprofit dedicated to supporting young adults in participating in Shabbat dinners. I mean, I speak with people at one table at least weekly, and they're part of every decision in the research process. And it doesn't mean they control the research process, but they're part of the conversation and the wisdom that they have accumulated in their years of work. We see that as a tool that improves the quality of the research, but also positions the research to be useful and used. And so that is just the way that we've designed the work. And I know that there is historically a lot of suspicion, I think, about entanglements between researchers and practitioners, and that can undermine the integrity of the endeavor. But I think we should also be open to the ways that it might enrich our capacity to actually understand what we're studying, and then also make sure that it is situated to be used and put to use.
Matt, Brandon.
Sure, I'll jump in and I'll make sure to leave time for you, Brandon. Well, where I am is even more practical than these are great ideas. And one of the reasons that I'm emeritus, that I decided to leave academia, was because I wanted to directly address this particular issue. And thankfully, the funding that Templeton provided to me created the groundwork. So what I'm working on now, I am, Wendy, writing some New York Times type books. We'll see if they ever get published. But more practically, I'm a part of an organization, co-founder of an organization called Ritual. We've created a mobile app that brings science-based well-being practices in small little audio packets. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of these practices that exist in the research literature. But unless you have a PhD and a research orientation, you don't know where to go to find them. And they're simple practices. And many of them have a basis in developing and helping foster a person's sense of spirituality and religiosity. Turns out some of those old spiritual disciplines are really good spiritual practices. We decided to work directly with individuals because we find that institutions just change really slowly. And while we tried to get work organizations to do things different, they just, even if they wanted to, they just couldn't move quickly. And so my sense is that reaching out directly to individuals and providing resources to them is one really a quicker way of helping people move towards flourishing. So that's what I'm about.
Thanks.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, this is such a great question. So I mean, here's the challenge, right? I mean, I think you were sort of asking us is how do we model flourishing, and it's very challenging as academics, as scholars. I mean, if you, I believe Nancy Cartwright, who argues that the kind of virtues of openness, curiosity, and humility are being beaten out of academia. In fact, with the sort of institutional pressures to publish or perish and so on. I mean, she argues in a very compelling way that a lot of the conditions for intellectual humility that science requires are no longer present in academia. So it's a tough environment in which to be a model for flourishing. And I've been thinking more in terms of depth rather than breadth. And so I've some of the things I've started doing is really investing in so at the one level in terms of teaching, really getting to know students, building deep connection among students, figuring out how to create the conditions for them to get to know each other in a post-pandemic world where many of them have lost basic social skills. And so to try to figure out how do we model flourishing in the classroom, and how do we create reimagine the classroom as a space of hospitality, that is a precondition, I think, to cultivating the love of learning. So that's one initiative. And another thing I've started doing is salon dinners and retreats where I bring people together, and they're not very big, 10 to 12 people, but really to go deep, right? And then there are scientists involved and artists and musicians spending time, and I use beauty as the catalyst, and it's having conversations around where people find beauty in their work, to experience moments of flourishing and to reimagine what flourishing in their in their realms of work would be like, whether it's in the research lab or in the classroom, right? So I think having a sort of a hopeful orientation becomes really critical to digging our way out of it's really clearly a mental health crisis in science that a lot of research is pointing to, and as is my own. But I think we do need to figure out how to be models of flourishing and to invest in that.
Thank you, Ariel, Matt, Wendy, Brandon. We're so grateful for your time today. I also want to thank the attendees for joining us, and for those of you who sent in your questions. Bios and links for each of our panelists are accessible in the resource gallery, so you are welcome to visit there. You can follow up and connect and better follow and understand the work that they are doing. We learned a lot today, not only in our understanding of just religion and spirituality and human flourishing, but I hope it's something you were able to take something from today that will help you in your own flourishing, whether it is grounded in what we have talked about, traditional research, traditional religion, faith, beliefs, practices, or even something that you may be carving out on your own. We are incredibly grateful for your time and hope that you found it enlightening. We're going to pass it back over to Reddy. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so very much for that, Giovanna, and your panelists. So much just stood out for us there. And religion is such a close part of our lives. It has shaped our consciousness, so many of us, but it is invigorating to think about it anew, to think about it in all the broad senses that you've articulated for us today. So thank you so very much. And a big thank you, of course, to the Templeton Religion Trust for the session in particular. So as a reminder, folks, that you can learn more about the TRT and the other partner organizations in the Partner Hub on the platform. There's a Partner Hub on the platform, and you can learn a little bit more about the partners. Next up, another scientific abstract presentation from the 2023 Global Call for Abstracts, introducing Sarah Meerhoff to present her work on motivation as a catalyst for human flourishing. Take a look.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah. I'm a PhD student in the Mental Health Neuroscience Lab led by Dr. Camilla Nord. Our lab is based at the University of Cambridge, and we're part of the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences unit. Today, I'll talk about motivation, its cognitive, behavioral, and physiological underpinnings, as well as ways that we can promote motivation and with that help people to work towards their goals and hopefully flourish. So you probably all have an idea of what motivation is. It is what gets you up in the morning to go to work or to school, or what gets you to go on a run when you really would rather stay at home and lie on the couch. In the field of cognitive neuroscience, we see motivation as behavior in pursuit of a goal, and that is despite of any challenges or efforts that we have to overcome to reach that goal. Variation of motivation and motivated behavior is very normal and seen both within and between individuals. And while this variation is normal to most of the extent, the lower end of the spectrum is seen as pathological. So in psychiatry, we refer to this lower end of the spectrum as the syndromes of apathy and anhedonia. Apathy and anhedonia are seen very frequently in psychiatric and neuropsychiatric patients, for example, in patients suffering from depression, anxiety, or schizophrenia, but also from neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease. Apathy and anhedonia are very debilitating syndromes, and patients that suffer from these syndromes have several negative outcomes, for example, higher risk of suicidality and more negative treatment outcomes. So to help improve the treatment of these syndromes, researchers have been aiming to improve our understanding of the mechanisms that underlie motivation in both health and disorder. Several brain regions have been closely linked to motivation, and most importantly here are those brain regions that are implicated with our dopamine signaling. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is linked to the way we perceive reward. Most likely, however, dopamine is not the only thing that influences our motivation. Other physiological processes may interact with our brain and with our dopamine signaling to shape our motivation and motivational experience. The physiological process that I'm interested in and that I'll be talking about today is the circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm is also referred to as our inner clock, and it is what aligns us with the 24-hour rhythm of the environment. People differ in the way their circadian rhythm aligns them with the environment, which leads to different chronotypes. So some people may have an early chronotype, meaning that they're larks, they get up early in the morning and then get quite tired early in the evening. Owls, on the other hand, are late chronotypes. They usually sleep in during the day, but then stay up longer during the night. There are two main reasons why I'm interested in circadian rhythm in the context of motivation and mental health. The first one is a close link between mental health and circadian rhythm. Across almost all psychiatric disorders, sleep disturbances are reported very frequently, for example, in the form of insomnia. Also, a late circadian rhythm, so a late chronotype, is highly overrepresented among psychiatric populations. And finally, experiencing a disruption in your circadian rhythm puts you at a high risk of developing a psychiatric disorder. So this may be, for example, in the form of shift work or frequent jet lag. And second, the circadian rhythm also shows a close and bidirectional link to our dopamine signaling. Both animal and human studies have found that the circadian rhythm may play a role in regulating our dopamine signaling. Vice versa, dopamine has also been shown to play a role in aligning our circadian rhythm. So the study that I'm presenting today investigates motivational cognition and its link to mental health, as well as to circadian rhythm. So when doing a study on motivation, the most important and first question will always be, how do we measure motivation? And the way we solve this is by letting participants play a computer game. In this computer game, participants were given a bunch of challenges, and each challenge was associated with an effort and with a reward. Participants then had to decide whether they wanted to accept this challenge, exert the effort, and win the rewards, or if they wanted to reject the challenge, not do anything effortful, but also not win any rewards. We then used this decision-making data from the game with a computational modeling approach and could with that infer on the underlying motivational decision-making process. After playing this game, participants were asked a series of questions targeting their mental health. Here we focused on the amotivational syndromes that I mentioned before, apathy and anhedonia, but also major depressive episode. Additionally to those mental health questions, participants were also asked to tell us about their circadian rhythm. We did this by asking questions such as when they prefer to go to bed and get up in the morning, but also at what time of the day they feel most energized. We can use these circadian questions to infer on participants' chronotype. So we can group participants into early, intermediate, or late chronotype based on these questionnaires. We then link the motivational parameters that we receive from the game and the computational modeling process to the questionnaires on mental health and chronotype. We did the study in a sample of 958 participants that were broadly representative of the UK, and I'm now going to show you what we found in this population. So our first finding was that mental health predicts motivation. Specifically, we found that subjects who score highly on the questionnaires targeting apathy and anhedonia show a lower motivation when playing the game. Specifically, this means that they were less willing to accept challenges, to exert effort, to win rewards. Now, as you can see in this plot, the results consider mental health on a dimension, going from poor to high or good mental health. In reality, however, our medical system categorizes people, for example, to be either depressed or healthy. So you may wonder how these dimensional results translate to such a categorical view of mental health. So what we did next is that we compared subjects that are currently depressed to healthy controls. And what we find was very much in line with our dimensional results. So the depressed participants also showed a lower motivation than the healthy controls. In the plot here, you can see the depressed group in purple and the healthy group in yellow. Specifically, this means that the depressed individuals were less likely to exert effort for reward. Our next finding concerns the circadian rhythm. So as I mentioned before, we could use the questionnaires to identify participants that had an early or late chronotype. And we then compared those two groups, also dependent on whether they played the game in the morning or the evening. We found that chronotype predicts motivation. Specifically, early chronotypes, here shown in red, showed a generally higher motivation than the late chronotypes, here shown in blue. Additionally, we found that this effect of chronotype on motivation interacts with the time of day. So on the x-axis of this graph here, you can see the morning testing on the left and the evening testing on the right. What we found was that there was a synchrony effect of chronotype and time of day. This means that the morning chronotypes had a higher motivation in the morning, their preferred time of day, and then a lower motivation when tested in the evening. The late chronotypes, on the other hand, showed the opposite pattern. They had a low motivation in the morning and a high motivation in the evening. So to summarize, we found that poor mental health is associated with low motivation in a cognitive behavioral assessment of motivational decision-making. Additionally, we found that the same motivational process is influenced by chronotype in a time-of-day dependent manner. So coming back to the spectrum of motivational drive, the critical question here is what we can do to promote motivation. How can we bring up those people that are at the low end of the spectrum to improve their motivation, allowing them to work towards their goal, improve their mental health, and ultimately to flourish? I believe that our study results have multiple implications that might contribute to this goal. First, considering psychiatric research and treatment. We show that circadian rhythm differences relate not only to mental health, but also to our motivational drive in a time-of-day dependent manner. These results should be taken into account both when researching this topic, but also when planning interventions on disorders of motivational deficits. Next to psychiatric practice, our findings may also have more general implications for policymaking. For instance, the finding that motivation and performance may differ based on individual differences of chronotype and time of day should be considered in the planning of the timing of school and work hours. Overall, I think that leveraging on circadian differences could promote motivation and ultimately facilitate flourishing across the population.
All right, great. We are going to now get another Flourishing in Action spotlight. This one is presented by Take Care. It's a story of gratitude. And gratitude, meaning living in an awareness of the giftedness of life. It is a vital component of human flourishing. In gratitude, we look to how we are supported and sustained by forces outside ourselves to whom we give thanks. Science has compellingly demonstrated that gratitude heals, energizes, and changes lives. And that's why I find being in this moment, moderating and emceeing, such a privilege, because we write these words, we say them, but I never would have imagined that there's a nexus of gratitude and science. And it is really enlightening to see it all play out through the work of Take Care. Much more than a switch that we turn out when things are going well, gratitude is also a light that shines in darkness. And there's so much darkness around the world today. I think we can all agree on that. Walking in Gratitude is a short film that depicts the healing power of gratefulness. It tells the story of one woman's journey into wholeness and healing through the power of grateful living. The film is part of Take Care, a national initiative rooted in science that provides the reflection, motivation, and implementation to inspire people to create health, well-being, and ultimately flourishing in their lives. Let's take a look.
In the mornings, I think about the fact that I get to actually enjoy this day. But how do you say thank you when your life is falling apart? How do you practice gratitude? I was so determined to prove I could be that mother of four that makes sure she's going to PTA and working full-time and going to school full-time and just keep pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. That's when I was diagnosed with chronic depression. Okay. I just couldn't function. Then I had to have 2 major surgeries. I had a hysterectomy, bladder replacement. That took everything. I remember I tried to get up to use the bathroom and I couldn't. And I remember pulling myself to the floor and was crawling to the bathroom. And I just started crying because that wasn't the place that I wanted to be. But all of a sudden, whatever was inside of me said, be grateful. Your husband is helping. Thank him. Thank your kids. And that's where my healing began. As I got stronger, I started to walk the trails. And as I walk in nature, it started doing something to me. Everything just felt whole. I would just say thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you that I get to walk today. So then I started to call it Gratitude Walk.
Hey, Nicola.
I started to invite my friends.
So nice to see you.
I decided after that I'm going to start a Facebook group. And now we do that every Saturday. After my experience, I did some research on gratitude because I wanted to understand what exactly was happening. Now I realize that it actually is one of the best therapeutic tools that you can use to take care of yourself. Before I couldn't see that. When I used to look at things, I would be like, oh my God, this is gonna threaten my safety. I'm not gonna be able to have money for this. It's stressful. But now I know if I just say thank you, stress is gone. And gratitude makes you present. That's one of the quickest ways to ground you and immediately just get some happy hormones flowing. The stress decreases because now you look at uncertainties as opportunities, not threats to your well-being. I've seen how that has humbled me. It's changed who I am. That's what gratitude does.